Hello, Tax Sutra viewers. Um, this is my wish list for the coming budget 23-24. I'm going to start with my input on at a macro level, and my expectations for the budget 23-24 are that the finance minister will focus on containing the budget deficit, the fiscal deficit, to 6.5%. But I think she will also set out a roadmap to get to 4.5%, hopefully by fiscal 26. We all know that inflation is an issue. Nonetheless, I think what we do need to do is to focus on growth, and growth higher than what is being currently projected. So I expect that the budget will try and focus on a stronger growth so that India gets to be the third largest economy over the next 5 or 6 years. There is talk of China plus one all the time, and I think India will want to focus on attracting companies to invest into India rather than them going to other geographies. So I think there will be a focus on reform, simplification, and certainty. And to get to things, one of the things India will want to do is to boost manufacturing. So as we all know, the 15% lower rate for new manufacturing companies is only available up to 31st of March 2024. I expect that the budget will extend this date, I hope, at least by 2 or 3 years. There is also a need to simplify Section 80JJAA because I think for the benefit of employment and job creation that we're trying to achieve, it is too little and too complex for this. Coming on to a few other things, I will first focus on foreign companies and international tax. So as far as significant economic presence is concerned, I think it should be restricted only to digital transactions. There is a need to narrow down the definition, which is currently way too wide and can impact adversely non-treaty countries. The equalization levy, similarly, there is, of course, 6% on digital ads and 2% on the e-commerce transactions. But similar to the interplay between royalty and equalization levy, I think there is a need to bring a little bit more clarity here. Of course, something which is, I think, long overdue and should be done promptly is to make sure that the rate of tax for foreign companies is reduced below 40%. Now, we also do not have DDT and dividends are taxable. So I think the big gap differential that currently exists between taxation rate for Indian companies and foreign companies is way too big. As we know, Pillar 2 and the Globe rules are now here to stay. I think it is important for the finance minister to bring enabling provisions into the act so that India does not lose tax revenues because Globe rules will now apply. On the transfer pricing front, I did want to cover one aspect. I think advanced pricing agreements are taking too long to get to a finalization. And we need to make sure that there is a time-bound program and APAs need to be agreed as soon as possible. One aspect to look at from a foreign perspective is sections 194 LC and LD. As we know, there is a 5% rate which applies, but that is also valid only up to 30th of June of the current year. And I think this date needs to be extended. Similarly, for 194 LD, we need to extend the date, but also make it applicable to non-INR denominated bonds. So some of these changes, I think, would be welcome from a foreign company perspective, from a foreign investor perspective. Coming to TDS norms, I have one key comment to make here. I think they are way too onerous on the taxpayer. I sense that over the years, every year, we are seeing more and more provisions being brought within the TDS ambit. Now, while I understand the intention of this, I think to some extent, the responsibility of the revenue is being shifted onto the taxpayer. And when provisions are very onerous, they are ambiguous at times, like Section 194R, which was introduced last year, I think it is expecting a little too much from the taxpayer. So I feel that this should now not be extended further. It should be simplified as much as possible and rationalized to the extent that the government can. Coming to mergers and acquisitions, I have a couple of comments to make here. One, when it comes to losses under 72A, a long-standing demand from the taxpayer has been that this largely applies to industrial undertakings and to banks and hotels. But if we realize the fact that the Indian economy is more than 50% a service economy, I think these provisions need to be extended to services as well, and not only to industrial undertakings. So I think this is a overdue amendment that's on the cards. The other aspect is to do with demergers, and it is important to make demergers tax neutral by considering that the SPV's business is also the business of the holding company if regulations so require. I think this will make it just much more simpler, and taxpayers are at the end of the day following what the regulator requires them to do. I have one comment on the buyback tax. This was introduced in 2013, as we all know, when LTCG was not there. We now have DDT, we have LTCG. So I think with dividends also being taxable, I think what is probably now required to be done is for capital gains to come back to be taxed in the hands of the transferor rather than companies pay a buyback tax. So I'm expecting that a change on this will happen. We've been hearing a lot of discussion around capital gains tax. I agree, it is way too complex, needs clear rationalization. I do hope and expect that the government will take action on this. We know for a fact that we have different periods of holdings, different type of assets, listed, unlisted equities, debt and equity being taxed differently, different rates applying. So I think it's become a complex maze. And if the government's intention is to simplify the tax law, then I think this is high time that the capital gains tax regime is simplified. I do hope, however, that it is not simplified with a view to increasing the tax burden, to create simplification, but also not to put more tax onerous requirements in terms of what the taxpayer has to do. And I do hope, with the capital markets not going to be looking too buoyant, given that the global economy is potentially facing recession, other than a few countries like India, then I hope that the holding period is not extended for equities, for example, from 1 year to 2 years. So while rationalization is the need of the day, I think it's very important to make sure that this is not done with a view to merely collecting more tax. There are several demands from PEs, VCs, and startups, and I will just cover a few of those. I think it's important for funds to be allowed the deduction for expenses that they incur. If you want to make it more attractive, if you want to attract foreign investment into the country, then I think it's very important that expense deduction is allowed for funds. The question also that is oft asked by startups and VCs is that why are unlisted shares taxed at a higher differential rate compared to listed shares? And there is some merit in that, and I hope the government looks into this in the coming budget. Startups have been asking now, their regime is, as we know, getting a little bit more tougher, and easy finance may not be available going forward in the near future. They are looking for a longer tax holiday to be able to stabilize their ship. So I think startups do want a 10-year tax holiday compared to, if you like, a 5-year tax holiday now. There is also possibly the requirement that lots of the startups earlier used to have their main office or incorporation outside of India. I think that a lot of them are looking to flip and operate from India because they feel that they can access the Indian capital markets and get better funding. If we want to encourage startups, then I think India should closely look at the domiciliation aspect of things. The other area that's been talked about a lot is about individual taxation. Now, if India wants to encourage the new tax regime, then they probably need to look at that closely because not too many taxpayers have opted for that. And perhaps a requirement is that the government looks at the slabs and rationalizes those a little bit more leniently. If it's the old regime we're looking at, there's a dire need to, I think, clean up Section 80C, which has been quite messy and has got quite complex. Also need to rejig slabs, perhaps, to look at items like interest on housing loans for self-occupied house properties, perhaps increase the limit there. If one wants to encourage insurance being taken for medical covers, I think there's a clear need to hike up those limits to more realistic levels. This would equally apply for various other provisions in the Income Tax Act. We have lots of old provisions lying around in the tax law with very small limits which are totally outdated. For example, casual income exemption is 5,000 rupees. It's quite a ridiculous amount. And I think some of this needs a revamp. And I'm hoping that in the coming budget, the government addresses these aspects. In closing, I would like to make one comment. As we all know, India is currently holds the presidency for the G20. Climate change and ESG are key issues being discussed at that key forum. Accordingly, I think if India wants to take the lead and wants to encourage capital flows into India, the budget can and should provide for incentives for green investments. For example, tax-paid bonds or lower GST on conversion kits from ICE to EVs, or reduction of the perquisite value for EV cars provided by employers compared to, if you like, for ICE cars. Similarly, interest on EV car loans, the date can be extended. It's about to expire in the next few months. And some of these are aspects where India can actually sign off on the budget and give a boost to its G20 presidency as well. Thank you, viewers. These are my comments for the upcoming budget.